The opening remarks. Please join us here, Dr. Ahmed. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. Welcome to our panel discussion called The Future of Syria, Turkish and US Perspectives, joined by both American and Turkish speakers. Throughout history, Syria and the Levant region has been very critical for peace and stability in the Middle East. The people of Syria fell under the dictatorship with the arrival of the Ba'ath regime, with a military coup in 1963. Since then, almost 60 years passed, while Syrian people missed a decent life. After his father, Hafez al-Assad, passed away in 2000, the year 2000, it's confusing me. Okay, no problem. After his father passed away in 2000, even the constitution was amended to allow the Bashar al-Assad to become the president. During 10 years, until what is called the Arab Spring, the Syrian people hopelessly waited for economic and political reforms, but none has arrived. After the fall of Arab dictators, the Syrian dictator too was about to fall. And 3 times he was about to fall. I consider he fell down, but he was salvaged by several foreign forces like Lebanon's Hezbollah, Iran, ISIS, and Russia. As you may remember, ISIS did not target the Assad regime, but targeted the democratic opposition. Of course, this brutal regime remained also because the Western powers let down the Syrian people, specifically the Obama administration that forgot his red lines of chemical weapons, etc., did not act and later chose to arm the Pkk or its derivatives with different names like PYD, Ypg, etc., under the pretext of fighting ISIS. However, this created further complications, putting old allies at odds with each other in Syria, I mean Turkey and the US. So the Syrian file has also been a victim of great power struggle, as China, for example, used almost all of its veto powers in the UN in its whole history to support the Assad regime. So out of something like 15, they used like 12, 13 vetoes in their history. So this is not fair, of course, for the Syrian people. And millions of refugees left their homes because of the assaults by Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime. This refugee problem is a humanitarian problem, of course, but still poses a serious political threat by allowing or bolstering radicalism in the region. And this caused also the rise of right-wing political parties in the West, and this also threatens the stability of Western democracies, even the unity of European Union. So Russia's aggression produced millions of refugees so far, and potentially more if they keep attacking Idlib, for example, today, and they are using it as a card to pressure Europe as we see it in Belarus. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Syrian problem concerns more than the Syrian people. In fact, as old allies, Turkish and American cooperation is still needed, very much needed in the Syrian crisis to push forward for political transition as envisaged in Geneva, also by putting pressure on Russia and the Assad regime for political transition, and not to escalate the situation against its citizens. We know that neither Russia nor Iran has an appetite to spend money or effort For the reconstruction of Syria, this is important. There is another area for cooperation between Turkey and political transition, and the reconstruction of Syria is very important. Turkey and the USA can lead this process of reconstruction. Without democratic transition and reconstruction, the Syrian refugees that are scattered all around the region and the globe will not go back to their homes, and they will remain as an issue of worries for all. If America wants to focus on the Far East, it wouldn't be possible without a stable and peaceful Middle East. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Syrian file has become very complicated, we know that, and Turkey and the US can do a lot to help solve the problems related to the future of Syria. Today, we will discuss these issues in its complexity by the experts from both sides, America and Turkey. So I hope that this panel will help bridge the perspectives to contribute to the well-being of Syrian people and the regional peace. So welcome you all. Thanks for listening, and I hope that will produce good and constructive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I'd like to invite now former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, James Jeffrey, to the stage. He also worked in a number of positions that are very relevant to Syria, and if you'll allow me, he was very in the trenches when it comes to making decisions and policies on Syria, being the special presidential envoy for the global coalition to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant under the Donald Trump administration, as well as the United States Special Representative for Syria engagement up until November 13, 2020. Please, Ambassador Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oysal. On behalf of ORSAM, thank you very much for organizing this very, very important conference, and I would like to thank all of you for coming here today. Syria is an extraordinarily serious and dangerous issue for the entire international community, not just for Turkey, not just for the United States. It is the most dangerous conflict right now in the Middle East, with 5 armies of major countries: Iran, Russia, the United States, Turkey, and, at least air forces, Israel, engaged inside Syria. At any time, this can lead to conflicts, and we've seen repeated conflicts among one or more of the actors. Secondly, it is, not Yemen, but Syria, the biggest humanitarian crisis in the region, if not the world, and those of you from Syria here today know that. I want to stress that. 12 million people, half the population, have been driven from their homes. Half of those 12 million refugees, including millions here in Turkey, which is doing an extraordinary job helping them. I visited those camps. But I also would like to thank, in particular, Jordan. I visited camps in Jordan also a few months ago. A lot of work is being done, but nonetheless, it is still a humanitarian disaster for the people of the country and the region. Finally, it's a geostrategic challenge to us all. Most of the players working together through the UN and individually to try to solve Syria, the Arab League states, Turkey, Israel, the European Union, the United States, the UN itself, are essentially status quo powers, believing in a global collective security system in order, avoiding aggression that overturns that system. If we are not careful, Russian and Iranian ambitions in Syria will do lasting damage to that entire system. That's another reason why we must be very, very vigilant, and we must work together. Okay, what's the current situation? Essentially, for the last 3 years, we have a frozen conflict in many respects. There's been very little change on the ground. Tragically, a few months ago, a shift to some degree in Dara, where we thought we had a balance between pro-Russian and pro-Iranian forces on the ground. But beyond that, very little change since 2018. There was a Turkish incursion in the Peace Spring area, but again, no major change, and in particular, the situation in Idlib, which is critical, has remained basically stable, although it's under threat, as we just heard, from the Russians and from the Assad regime. It's very, very important that that area remain quiet. The international community, including the United States, is focused in the Middle East right now on the Iranian nuclear count, the return to the JCPOA. Thus, Syria is not getting the attention it deserves. But again, given the humanitarian cost and given the danger of all of these military forces inside the country, it is a pressing concern for the international community, and it needs to be dealt with. What are the major interests? Let's start with, if you will, the other side. In Assad's case, it's simple survival. We've seen that again and again. He has refused compromises, including those offered at the highest levels of the U.S. government, for any kind of settlement that would allow his people to return, allow money to flow to rebuild a country, but requiring him to share power and to change his behavior. He refuses. He would rather rule on top of rubble than give up his evil control of what's left of his country. Russia went in to secure what it thought was its, on economic terms, sunk costs, its military bases in Syria, its power projection capabilities, however modest, and a friendly government. But since then, we've seen Russia looking beyond just that, because it feels that it has succeeded in those things, and it probably has. Rather, Russia sees itself as, if not replacing, competing with the order that the Arab states of the region, Turkey, Israel, Europeans, and the UN have worked so hard for the last 40, 50 years. The Russian idea is a return to the 19th century, where the great powers of the region, who are they? Well, the only good news is it includes Turkey, but Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and the United States compete for power like in the Balkans in the 19th century. The problem with that particular arrangement is we all know what happened in the Balkans in the 19th century, specifically in the summer of 1914, the beginning of almost 30 years of unending, or almost unending, global war. And that's what we see with Russia. With Iran, it's different. Iran's goal, and this isn't just the Quds Force, although they have the mission of carrying it out, this goes very deep inside Iranian society, well beyond the Ayatollahs who run the place. And that is an Iranian security system to replace what we could call the Western or the current system, with Iran the dominant power, as at various times in the last 4,000 years we've seen with the Persian Empire. Thus, there is general threats to the region if the Syrian situation is not resolved. In terms of, again, the Arab countries, their interests are to avoid the expansion of Iran, avoid the terrible tragedy among their fellow Arab citizens of that country, and see the country return to normal. In the case of the Europeans, it's very much following UN mandates and seeing the rule of law, things such as the chemical weapons use of Assad. Turkey today will be able to talk more, but from our standpoint, it is a whole series of issues that have Turkey defending Turkey across the frontier. It is the fear of a new assault from the Pkk. It is the 3 million refugees that Turkey has and the fear that more will come. There's 3 million people, mainly displaced people right now in Idlib, close to the Turkish border. I've been there. I've seen them. There is the threat of Iran, the threat of Russia, which is pressing in the Black Sea, in the Caucasus, in Ukraine, also from the south, and the Iranian threat, and there's Assad himself, no friend of Turkey's. So there are many security concerns that has Turkey involved. In the case of the United States, it's all of the above as one of the managing powers of this regional coalition. But what is the American policy at this point? I can talk at length about the American policy of the last administration with 3 of my colleagues who worked with me on that, but we're now talking about the Biden administration, and I'm not a member of that, so we really need an official Biden administration explanation of its policies. I can, looking at it from the outside, give you some insight, but it's only insight, and it's only not quite hearsay, but it may not be definitive, and I'll get to that in a second. But I have talked recently with very senior officials in a position to know and to have roles in Syria, and they've also begun talking on background more with various news outlets on what the policy is beyond the somewhat infantile, we're against the Daesh or Islamic State, and we're all for humanitarian aid. That's no surprise. Show me a crisis in the world involving a humanitarian problem or terrorists, and America would not take that position. But what more are we going to do there? And how do we not just manage those problems of humanitarian disaster and an ISIS presence, how do we deal with the roots of those things? That gets you back to a change in Syria and a change in the policies of the Syrian government that are responsible for the rise of Daesh and responsible for the humanitarian crisis that just here in Turkey alone has sent 3 million refugees across the border. You've got, thus, at 3 levels, as America looks at this, be it this administration, the last one, or the administration of President Obama, particularly John Kerry, who put a lot of effort into this in the last 2 years, you've got a crisis at 3 levels. I've already talked about the geopolitical crisis. If Iran and Russia, through horrific use of war criminal activities, barrel bombs, chemical weapons, succeed in overturning the security system. That's the top level, the most dangerous thing probably in the long run. At the immediate level, you have this humanitarian crisis. You have a civil war that has torn apart this country and destroyed its cities. But you also have, at an intermediate geopolitical level, a whole series of crises. And a few weeks ago I was at 6, I'm now up to 8. What are they? Let's start with the Iranian missile and rocket systems. They're trying to create a second southern Lebanon in Syria. But it goes beyond that. If you look carefully at what the Iranians are doing in places like Dar es-Zor, they're trying to change the population, change the religious ideology, change the loyalties like they have done in Iraq and Lebanon. And the end station for that is a collapsed, failed state like Lebanon that serves only one master, which is Iran and its geostrategic interests. So Iran is a very important strategic factor. It's what has brought the Israeli Air Force in, and it has created major concerns from Jordan to Turkey. You've got the use of chemical weapons. We know Assad still has chemical weapons. When he gets the chance, if he doesn't fear retaliation from us, the British and French, he'll use them again. We're sure of that, or I'm sure of that. We have the whole set of Turkish concerns that I mentioned, the security along Turkey's southern border. That's why Turkish troops are in Syria, and I do not see them leaving. Again, talk to Turks about this. I do not see them leaving, looking at it from the outside, until somebody fixes those security problems. You have the reintegration of the whole Northeast, which is a quasi-separate state with us and the Russians, and the SDF, formerly the YPG and the PYD there, with all of the concerns Turkey has, all of the frictions with Assad, and so on and so forth. You have the problem of Daesh, or the Islamic State. In the Northeast, it's basically under control. In the rest of Syria, as we just saw the other day, when 13 Syrian soldiers were killed by a Daesh attack, it is raging out of control because Assad creates and to some degree encourages this terrorist movement. He can't really fight it. You've got, again, the 12 million people. We know some of them who we've worked with at the Rukban camp. They are very reluctant to return no matter what is promised. unless they know that their families will not be subject to the arbitrary violence of the Assad regime. And we can't make a guarantee, so it's going to be hard to get them back. We have the UN political process. That's a very important component, the UN Resolution 2254, that all 15 then members of the Security Council, including Russia and China, signed up to. That needs to be implemented. Finally, we have the drug trade that the Syrian government is using to try to finance its military actions and avoid the sanctions and the other economic pressures that we and others are putting on the Syrian government. These things have to be fixed for any final settlement of Syria. None of them will be fixed without changes in the behavior of the Syrian government. It is not the policy, it was not the policy of the Trump administration, and I see no indication whatsoever it's the policy of the Biden administration to overthrow the Syrian government and replace it with a new one, rather to see through the UN process in 2254 changes in the behavior, the makeup, and the whole nature of that government so that you don't have these crises continue. So, the U.S. policy right now, again, I cannot speak authoritatively, but what we're hearing is, beyond the humanitarian and the counterterrorism elements, there is every intention of keeping troops on in Syria. Where and how many, that's not clear, but I think we will keep our troops on in Syria and probably next door in Iraq as well. There is continuing implementation of the sanctions, but not as aggressively as before, and that needs to be looked at closely. There is a general reluctance at times to have people, particularly Arab states, reach out to Assad. We've seen indications, particularly recently with the United Arab Emirates, that the administration asked the foreign minister not to go to Damascus. But we see other indications from our friends in the Arab world that they're getting, at best, mixed messages on how much contact they should have. Again, we're not quite sure what that will produce. The administration is obviously opposed to the chemical weapons and generally weapons of mass destruction. It claims at times that it, under more realistic conditions than we supposedly were doing it, it is blocking Iran's expansion in the country, but exactly what that means we don't know. It stresses the security of Israel and Jordan, and that is very much tied up with the Iranian forces right across the border. So, in general, you have what seems to be a policy not all that different than the one that we were doing in the last administration, and to some degree the one that John Kerry was trying to do now 6 years ago. But the administration has not been clear in public, on the record, on what its policy is. That is my pitch to the administration, it's my pitch to the public, to the media. We need to know. We have troops on the ground, Turkey has troops on the ground, the Syrian opposition has troops on the ground, Israel, Russia, Iran. This is not something that we can just try to divine what the policy of my government, of the Turkish government, or any other government. We need to know what is going on. Finally, to move forward, we need a unified position. This begins with the United States and Turkey. Our work on Syria, despite disagreements on the situation in the Northeast, has been very productive. We supported Turkey 1,000% in Idlib. We work with Turkey on the UN 2254 process. Unlike Turkey, we're not a member of the Astana group, but we welcome Turkey's usually very productive role in the Astana group, limiting some of the ideas the Russians and the Iranians have. Under any and all circumstances, you're not going to have a solution to Syria without Turkey, and that means American-Turkish cooperation. But it goes beyond that. Turkey needs to reach out to the other entities, the other states and systems that are concerned about Syria. much more contact, not just at government-to-government levels, but in meetings like this, in the think tank world, the NGO world, the media world, with your European colleagues, your Arab League colleagues, Israel, the UN. You have good relations with the Syrian opposition. That needs to continue. This has to be a collective effort. If you want to shape American policy, the more America hears similar messages from all of its partners and friends in the region, the more you will have, I think, a happy policy. So, the bottom line is, as you're trying and as I'm trying to figure out exactly what the policy is and how it will react, mention at every occasion, any successful policy has to fix the Iranian problem. It has to fix the refugee and internally displaced persons problem. It has to deal with Turkey's security concerns along its southern border. It has to deal with the situation in the Northeast in a way that suits the United States, suits the Turks, and suits the people of the Northeast and the rest of Syria. It has to deal with the situation of Daesh. It has to deal with the chemical weapons question. It has to deal with the drug trade. Those are all major international issues. Without a solution to them, you don't have an effective policy. So let's keep working together and exchanging views, and thank you again for your interest in this very, very important subject.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for that wonderful and insightful speech. As you all can conclude, this is a very important topic for Syria, for Turkey, for the United States, for the region at large. And as the Ambassador very clearly explained, there are a number of issues that are related to Syria, but also are related to the security and safety and the interests of regional actors and international actors. And in order to go more into depth on that, I'm going to invite our panel to the stage. First, I would like to invite our moderator, Dr. Ismail Nu'man Telji. He is the the Vice President of ORSAM. He's going to be moderating this panel session with our speakers. Dr. Ismail Nu'man is going to be moderating the panel, as I mentioned. I'd like to now invite our speakers. Joel Rayburn, please, if you could join us on the stage. Mr. Joel Rayburn is the former U.S. State Department envoy for Syria and worked alongside Ambassador Jeffrey and our other speakers as well during the Trump administration on the Syria file. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Oytun Orhan, and he is the coordinator for Levant Studies at ORSAM, and he's going to be joining us here as well. I think there's names. Yeah, there we go. And next, I would like to invite Mr. Andrew Tabler. Andrew is the former Director of Syria Policy at the National Security Council and a senior advisor to Ambassador Jeffrey. And last but not least, I'd like to invite Mr. Richard Outson to the stage, and he is the former U.S. State Department senior advisor for Syria engagement and also worked alongside the gentleman here and Ambassador Jeffrey. I'm going to leave the microphone now to Dr. Ismail Nu'man Telji.
Hello, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, President ORSAM's President, Professor Medusa, for his talk, and thank you for Ambassador Jeffrey for your talk. It was very informative, and we all benefited. And actually, the topic itself was a kind of a brief outline of the situation in Syria and the potential topics that we will discuss further, because this is a good opportunity for all of us to deal with Syrian issue in a more detailed way, because there are already topics that were mentioned, like the U.S. exit strategy and the threats and challenges and opportunities, and the position of and the future of non-state actors, and the role of external actors, obviously Russia and Iran and also others, and you mentioned as well Israel, and the Turkish-US cooperation or potential further divisions, and also some minor but important details like chemical weapons and drug trade. So these are the topics that we will discuss in our panel now. But of course, this is not limited, because I know that there are some other dimensions of the crisis that our prominent speakers from the US and from Turkey will mention. So I won't have to introduce our speakers, because our also other moderator has already done. So I want to start with Joel, with you. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Is this already on? Okay, it is. I'll give some broader thoughts. I think we can. Some of my other colleagues here are going to go into some more specific areas. I'd like to give some broader thoughts on the strategic direction of the major powers regarding Syria, and where I think there are some pitfalls and gaps in the policies that we've seen over the last few years, and certainly in 2021. I think we would all do well to be realistic about the situation in Syria. And the first part of being realistic is accepting the simple truth, and this is a fundamental truth, that there is no going back to the Syria of 2010 and before. That Syria of the Assad regime as it looked, the society as it was constituted, and the communities as they interrelated in 2010 and before, that Syria is gone forever. It's not coming back. As far as I can tell, Bashar al-Assad has no intention of trying to bring it back. And Syria, the old Syria being swept away, there's going to be a new Syria of some kind. And we all have a stake. The international community has a stake, Syria's neighbors have a stake, and the Syrian people have the largest stake in what the new Syria is going to look like. There are some real dangers to what the new Syria could look like, but there are also some real opportunities. So I think governments right now that are formulating policies on an idea of returning to a pre-2011 kind of arrangement, those policies have already failed. They're already doomed to failure, and it's a waste of time. It's actually a distraction from spending the energy properly and the diplomatic bandwidth properly and the national power properly to try to account for what Syria is now and what it could become in the future, for good or ill. The second point I'd like to make is that there's been an awful lot of talk over the last couple of years about how to deal with Bashar al-Assad as himself and his regime, and there have been growing calls for recognizing that Assad has weathered the storm in Syria and just needs to be dealt with as a reality. This is why I said what I said in my first point, which is that this is a different Syria now. That's old Syria. The old Assad regime is gone forever, not ever going to be patched back together again. But in addition to that, for those that are proposing normalization of relations with the Assad regime as it's currently constituted, or proposing some kind of roadmap to stability that runs through Bashar al-Assad himself, I haven't seen a realistic proposal along those lines that's put forward by anybody. There have been a lot of proposals, a lot of calls for normalization, but what is the strategic plan behind that normalization? What is the path? People who propose normalization with Assad, I think it's the burden of proof is on these people to explain to everybody else the steps that you would go through to get to a stable outcome in Syria that is acceptable to the interests of the international community and to Syria's neighbors and to the Syrian people. I haven't yet seen one. It would be one thing if we were talking about two different paths to a stable a positive outcome in Syria. One that runs through Bashar al-Assad and one that does not run through Bashar al-Assad. But we're not talking about that. As far as I can see, there is no path to a positive outcome in Syria that runs through the regime of Bashar al-Assad, unreformed as it stands on its terms. I think that's a figment of the imagination. And any policies that are built on that premise, those policies are already doomed to failure as well. And they're just really leading the international community into a cul-de-sac that we'll eventually have to wake up and find our way out of, but from a greater position of disadvantage. The third observation I would make about the Syrian situation is that it's also not a situation where the conflict can just be sort of contained. You can maybe draw a ring around Syria and just say whatever else is going to happen in Syria, we can just sort of ignore it, leave it alone, and just deal with it as a matter of status quo going forward. That's because the nature of the Assad regime and the nature of the conflict that the Assad regime is driving, it's radioactive. It won't sit there quietly. The Assad regime cannot be counted upon to sit there in a weak and quiet and tame state. Their nature requires them to do things that will unleash further and further problems for Syrians, but for the entire surrounding region and beyond. Every problem that the international community is suffering as a result of the Assad regime's nature and the conflict that's been unleashed in Syria will get worse the longer the Assad regime sits there as it is. The refugee problem will only get worse. The refugee problem is not going to be solved with the Assad regime sitting in Damascus as it is. I would say the terrorism problem will get worse, both because the Assad regime sponsors terrorism as a matter of policy, as a matter of statecraft, as a matter of its grand strategy, and has done for 50 years. The weapons of mass destruction problem, Ambassador Jeffrey touched on this. The weapons of mass destruction problem in the Middle East, which runs mainly through the Assad regime and the Iranian regime, this will get worse for the region as the Assad regime continues, because what we knew in the Trump administration was that the Assad regime was already seeking to reconstitute its weapons of mass destruction program. And the Assad regime is inclined to use those weapons and inclined to proliferate those kind of capabilities, and to use them as a threat against Syria's neighbors, ostensibly against Israel. But does anyone here think that the Assad regime doesn't also seek to, and didn't already seek to have an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction so that it could threaten Turkey as well, so that it could constitute a threat against Turkey as well? Remember that the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad, they're the ones who decided to bring North Koreans to the Euphrates River to build a nuclear reactor in 2007 that the Israelis did us all the favor of destroying at that time. Same decision makers at the top of that regime. Do we really think that this is a regime that has seen the light and is not going to seek to reconstitute weapons of mass destruction that would be a threat to regional security and international security in the future? Ambassador Jeffrey also mentioned what has become a growing problem with the Assad regime, which is that it's become a narco state. It's become one of the worst narco states in the world. Maybe if we were to consult the experts at the Drug Enforcement Agency and elsewhere, we might find it is the worst narco state in the world. I don't know. It's certainly the worst one in this region, exporting Captagon in industrial quantities to the Gulf countries, exporting hashish to the North African countries, and presumably, I don't have specific information on this, but whatever they're exporting to the Gulf countries, to North Africa, presumably the Assad regime is attempting to traffic into Turkey as well. So this is a regime which, in order to make its main revenue generator right now, I think, is to send this poison into the entire surrounding region. And that problem is going to get worse and worse and worse the longer the regime sits there as it is. Lastly, I think The last radioactive problem that I would touch on, there are probably 100, but these are the major ones, is the Iranian regime's military expansion into the Arab world in a way that I think is unprecedented since the Safavid Empire. Someone could maybe historian or some could correct me if that's wrong, but it seems to me that's the case. And it's one of the I think it's the single most destabilizing factor in the entire region now. Assad is the gateway for this Iranian military expansion into the Levant, to the borders of Turkey. Could we 10 years ago, 11 years ago, could anyone in Ankara have predicted that the IRGC and Hezbollah would have a major strategic outpost in Aleppo now that is oriented on northern Syria and on Turkey? That's something that would have been unthinkable just a little over a decade ago, but there it is right in your face today in 2021, and it's getting worse. And it will get worse over time. Assad, apparently, we could psychoanalyze him all day. He apparently believes it's in his interest to expand the IRGC, the Iranian military footprint. Let's face it, to bring Afghans and Pakistani Shia to the Turkish borders. He somehow thinks that that's a benefit for him. To bring Iranian missiles, rockets, and drones to the borders of all his neighbors. He seems to think that that serves his interest. That will expand in the future. Okay, this is a long way. Let me circle back to my point. It's a long way of saying that unfortunately you cannot ignore the Assad regime and its behavior and its nature. The problem will get worse the longer it goes untreated. I would say, as a fourth point, I would underline everything I've just said by saying I'm not the only one that thinks this way. My colleagues here, Ambassador Jeffrey, we're not the only ones who think this way in the United States. I would say this is the prevailing mood in the United States among those people that work on Syria, but also those people that just view Syria maybe out of the corner of their eye. And I don't see any significant sentiment or movement or any idea that would get significant traction to normalize with Assad or to just ignore all of these problems and to accept and just to tolerate them at the center of the Middle East. My last point is that I think the critique I would make of U.S. policy on Syria right now in 2021, and for most of the time since 2011, and from what we're seeing from other governments during most of that time, is that they fail when they don't consider the Syrian conflict comprehensively. When they don't, when they craft policies or they take actions that are oriented toward one or another symptom of the overall conflict, as opposed to trying to address or at least mitigate the underlying causes of the conflict. The major two causes of the conflict that we've confronted over the last decade, as far as I can see, the internal conflict is driven by the nature of the Assad regime and the political conflict that the Assad regime created inside Syria in order to hold on to power as a minoritarian, tyrannical government. The kind of things the Assad regime had to do to hold on to power as that kind of government without popular legitimacy is what drives the conflict even now. And secondly, I think that the major cause of the expansion of the conflict has been this insertion of the Iranian military into the Levant. I want to put to you, in the Trump administration, we came up with a formula rather than, and Ambassador Jeffrey and I kind of brainstormed this at the beginning of our tenure in the Trump administration in 2018. We were constantly asked by people in the media and by other diplomats, Bashar al-Assad, stay, go, thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways. And it was, every question we dealt with was just about the person of Bashar al-Assad himself. We said, hang on a minute, let's back away from the Syrian problem and let's see where U.S. and international interests actually lie. what are the things that we would require, the United States would require from any state in Damascus, any government in Damascus, Bashar al-Assad or his brother or someone we don't even know, regardless. What were the things that we would require in the United States to have a normal relationship with that government? The first one was stop being a state sponsor of terrorism. The second one we decided was stop being the gateway for the Iranian regime military to invade the Arab world. Third, stop having a policy of being a threat to your neighbors. Fourth, get rid of your weapons of mass destruction programs once and for all in a verifiable way. That hasn't been done yet. Fifth, create the conditions in Syria so that refugees can return safely to their homes. And sixth, hold war criminals accountable for what's happened over the last decade and more. Now, over time, and what that allowed us to do was to zero in on the root problems of the behavior of the Syrian government, regardless of the personality at the top. Because of those 6 conditions that I just listed, 4 of them predate 2011. So even if we were somehow to turn back the clock to 2010, which is, as I said, is impossible, we would still have a problem. We would still have major problems with the Syrian government that could not be ignored and would be problems for international security. How can we know this? Well, let's just think of these things that I just listed, these behaviors I just listed, or these problems that Ambassador Jeffrey and I have mentioned, if they were coming from some other country. Let's say, for example, suddenly the government of Belgium began sponsoring terrorist attacks into France. Would that be acceptable? Would we say, well, you know, that's just the Belgian government, that's just what they do, the Belgian regime? Or if they suddenly started building the weapons of mass destruction arsenal to use potentially against Germany or France, or if suddenly they attacked their own population and drove half of the Belgians into France or Germany or Luxembourg, for example, or the Netherlands, I guess, if they can get across the river, and on and on, or if they became a Captagon exporting narco state, we wouldn't tolerate that behavior from any other country in the world, even if one of those kinds of misbehaviors were going on from somewhere else, from Belgium or Ireland, for example. Would we tolerate, for example, that Ireland would invite some other country to station rockets and missiles in Ireland and then fire them at England? And would we just say, well, that's just what they do, and we have to actually, and as a response, for example, we would say, well, we need to increase our funding for early recovery in Ireland. I mean, that would be preposterous. But I'm saying it is preposterous. Those proposals are preposterous. And you can see that they're preposterous if you just pick them up and put them down in some other continent. It's absurd. It's lunacy. It's deranged. And that's essentially what we confront right now. I used to say early on in my tenure at the State Department, 2018, 2019, sometimes people would ask, so how's it going with Syria? And I would say, well, no one's making good decisions yet. And sometimes I would say, including us. Now, over time, Ambassador Jeffrey and I think we got the Trump administration, the United States, start making some good decisions. So after a while, I would exclude us. But we have to be careful of getting into a situation where the answer to that question is, no one's making good decisions yet, or no one's making good decisions again. So really, this is I think, these are the pitfalls of the policy debates, and we need really to shift them back to reality, or we're all going to pay it's going to be, you thought the last decade was painful. We'll have another decade of pain, I think, going forward if we don't get realistic pretty fast.
Thank you, Joel, for your presentation. And I see many parallels, actually, in your presentation with the Turkish point of view regarding Syria. So basically, the areas of concern are kind of similar. And they need joint efforts to deal with, probably. So maybe Oytun can help us to better understand the Turkish position toward Syria. Then we will continue with the other speakers.
My presentation, actually, I will try to mostly focus on the Turkish perception of the U.S. Policy towards the northeast Syria and U.S. policy towards PYD. But before getting into that, I will also try to list the Turkish priorities in Syria in order to have a better understanding of Turkish perception towards U.S. policy. With regards to Turkish priorities in Syria, I think the Turkish policy towards Syria has shifted, like in elsewhere in the world, depending on the changing nature of the Syrian conflict. The Turkish policy towards Syria has shifted, and with the rise of radical movements and also terrorist organizations in Syria, which claim sovereignty mostly on the Turkish border areas, had critically affected the Turkish perception of Syria. So in that regard, I could list the Turkish priorities in Syria maybe into four things. And first, the fight against terrorism, of course. This mainly refers to YPG, the Pkk branch of Syria. But it's not only limited with YPG, of course, it also relates to ISIS and also Al-Qaeda, other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups mainly based in Idlib. Fight against terrorism is a major concern for Turkey. Second critical principle of Turkish Syria policy is the territorial integrity and the political unity. Mostly the territorial integrity is raised, but I think the political unity is more important than that, because when we look at the Iraqi example, we see that we somehow preserved the territorial integrity, but the political unity is more important than that. If we have a kind of federalist structure in Syria, this could threaten the Turkish interest in Syria. So the territorial integrity and political unity is a very critical principle in Turkish Syria policy. The third one is preventing new mass migrations from Syria, and also establishing suitable conditions for Syrians to return to their homeland. This is also a major concern for Turkey. And lastly, finding a political solution based on UN Security Council Resolution 2254. This is also a major concern for Turkey. Based on that, I could say that Turkey has a different perception towards the west and east of Euphrates River. Turkey tries to protect the status quo on the west of Euphrates River, in Idlib and also in elsewhere. But when we look at the east of Euphrates River, Turkey is trying to change the status quo. Turkey is not satisfied with the current power balance on the east of Euphrates River. So Turkey has a contradictory approach towards the different regions in Syria. Depending on those priorities, I would like to classify the Turkish policy towards U.S. policy about northeast Syria and also towards PYD. And in that regard, I will try to mostly discuss 4 points. First of all, the U.S. entity, military entity in Syria and possible U.S. withdrawal from Syria. Secondly, U.S. policy to unite PYD and non-PYD parties in Syria. Third, separating Pkk and Ypg policy. And fourth, which I will discuss, is the US-Russia deal, which I will try to discuss more. Starting with the US entity in Syria and possible US withdrawal. In that regard, I think Turkey has both opportunities and risks. In Turkey, the US withdrawal from Syria is discussed mostly in the context of opportunities, because Turkey thinks that at least the public opinion thinks that if U.S. withdraws from Syria, this will lead to undermining of the YPG. They will not have a protection, U.S. protection. So in that regard, Turkey will have got the upper hand to conduct military operations against YPG. So in that regard, in general, the Turkish public opinion is with a U.S. withdrawal from Syria. But among the Turkish decision makers, I think there is a different kind of understanding, a perception. They think that if U.S. withdraws from Syria, this could also lead to some kind of risks, which could lead to a Russian and regime domination in Syria, which is not will be welcomed by Turkish decision makers. So in that regard, there is a contradictory perception about U.S. withdrawal from Syria. About the U.S., about the PYD and non-PYD parties, unification of those entities, the so-called Syrian Kurdish Front, establishing the Syrian Kurdish Front in Syria. In that regard, Turkey has two problems. First of all, Turkey thinks that this policy will not succeed. It is impossible that the PYD will let other non-PYD parties to have a share in the administrative and political setup and also security setup. So this process will not succeed. And secondly, the other Turkish problem, in the case of a success, if the U.S. succeeds to unite these entities, this will not lead Turkish authorities or institutions to accept the new entity, the new umbrella entity as a legitimate entity, but it will delegitimize the entities which is already accepted by Turkey. So I think there are two problems with this U.S. policy to unite PYD and non-PYD parties. First of all, it will not succeed, and even if it succeeds, Turkey will not accept this entity as a legitimate one. The third issue is separating Pkk and Ypg. Again, in that regard, I think Turkey thinks that this U.S. policy is impossible to succeed. There is a U.S. policy to transform the YPG, PYD, a local organization, a Syrian organization, which will not threaten Turkey. But I think Turkey thinks that this is a mission impossible, and Turkey is aware that there are some tendencies within YPG that supports the idea that YPG should not threaten Turkey, the Syrian entities, but in reality the PKK, which has a very strong central authority, will not let the Syrian entities within YPG will let to have such kind of an policy. So this is the third point, and the last one is the US-Russia deal. There are some signs of US-Russia deal. Maybe it is too early to discuss, but at least in the Turkish perception, there are some signs of US and Russia deal in at least in a kind of coordination or understanding in Syria. What are the signs of that? First of all, the energy deal. Maybe Mr. Tabler will discuss this in a detailed way, but a kind of energy deal between Egypt and Lebanon, the transfer of Egyptian natural gas to Syria, via Syria to Lebanon, is a kind of exemption from the US side, which is seen as a kind of a recognition of the Assad regime. The second one is the energy deal, which was signed by an energy company in US and the YPG, the so-called PYD administration. This was cancelled by Biden administration, which is seen a kind of gesture from the Biden administration. and Assad's normalization process. This is also seen a kind of US green light for Russia, for the Assad regime, and also the Idlib policy. In past, we have seen that US was criticizing the Russian attacks against civilians in Idlib, but lastly we have seen that US is not raising its voice against the Russian attacks in Idlib. So it is also a seen from the Turkish point of view a kind of Russian or US approval for Russian attacks and a kind of Russian and US agreement on Syria. And lastly, the opening of Syrian airspace to Russian jets in Syria. This is also seen a kind of Russia and US agreement or a kind of agreement in Syria. So in this regard, finally, I want to discuss the possible Turkish moves in northeast Syria in that context. So from Turkish point of view, there is a kind of US and Russia agreement or coordination in Syria, which makes Turkish possible moves against YPG more complicated. And I think this, if it is real, we see some evidences of that agreement, but it is not clear yet. But if it is real, I think this makes the Turkish moves in Syria much more complicated, because Turkey was trying to find a maneuver field in Syria depending on the US-Russia differences, disagreements. But if there is a kind of US and Russia agreement on Syria, this will limit Turkish moves in Syria. So this will most probably at least delay the Turkish military moves in Syria. And this agreement, US-Russia agreement, will most probably make Turkey and Russia confront to each other. In past, Turkey was mostly criticizing US for its YPG policy, but in case the Russians are getting the main protector of the YPG, then this will lead that Turkey will direct its critics towards Russia more in the future. So this is the main issues, topics that I want to raise. Maybe we can discuss in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Oytun, for your clear-cut messages and also points of potential conflicts between Turkey and US relations regarding the Syria. So now maybe we can go more into detail. Maybe you can, Andrew, he will be giving us some detailed aspects of energy and Assad's normalization efforts. So please, we can have your view on this.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you to ORSAM for organizing this and for the invitation. It's been a pleasure being with you here today, and it's a pleasure to be on the stage with such a great group and former colleagues and current colleagues. I'm going to explain a little bit and go into a little bit of detail off the first two presentations. I wondered, can we put up the slide deck, please? It'll help a little bit. Hopefully get everything squared away. And while they do that, just a few thoughts. And I realize this is up on a big screen, so resolution sometimes can be hard. But yeah, exactly. It probably looks like a Christmas tree, as we say in the United States, or I don't know what it would be, a Ramadan bazaar in the Middle East. But I assure you it'll lead to something a little bit less celebratory. So a couple of things. First of all, at the end of the Trump administration, and when the new team took over, there has been a tremendous amount of, there has been a reevaluation as publicly addressed by the administration, or a review of Syria policy. This has been going on since January, technically. According to, and there's an excellent article in Sharq al-Awsat by Ibrahim Hamidi that outlines this. Joel referenced it earlier, I believe, that talks about the outcome of this review. This report says that the review is finished. It's unclear exactly. We've had mixed messages. The way that this review was conducted that we know from these external comments and so on is that the Biden administration was concerned about the humanitarian situation inside of Syria, which is completely understandable. Over half of Syrians are outside of their homes. Well over 600,000 plus have been killed. Many more disappeared. Over 2 million or 2.3 million are, I believe, in Turkey, maybe more. It depends on it officially. Also Jordan and Lebanon. This is the 21st century's first humanitarian disaster. And the fact is that no matter what policies we came up with, Syrian people were going to be suffering. And they wanted to try and alleviate that suffering as the negotiations, the long drawn-out negotiations over a settlement of the war continued. Now, at the same time, there was a reevaluation of the Trump administration's pressure campaign on the Assad regime. And what I mean by that is the Trump administration devised a policy where, I'm going to use metaphors here, where sticks would be used, particularly economic sticks in the form of sanctions, but also diplomatic sticks in the form of isolation, and also sometimes military sticks in the form of military strikes or allowing allies to operate militarily inside of Syria to pressure the regime into a settlement under UN Security Council Resolution 2254. So as Ambassador Jeffrey said, as Joel reiterated, our policy was not regime change, but rather the completely understandable goal of trying to get the Assad regime into a negotiation over what had been internationally agreed years ago during the Obama administration. The administration pointed to what they described as a tidal wave of sentiment in the Arab countries to normalize relations with Assad. Now, at first, this was not confusing. There had been a number of countries from the Gulf who had talked about this, the United Arab Emirates in particular, who had attempted to reopen their embassy in Damascus. The U.S. efforts during the Trump administration got them to stop that effort or to delay it. But a lot of Arab countries began to postulate that instead of using sticks, that carrots, incentives, economic incentives in particular, could lead Assad in a different direction towards a more reasonable outcome to the negotiated settlement that we all wanted and have agreed upon and need in Syria. But to be honest, the Arab position is not monolithic. Indeed, I think the UAE does want to engage with Damascus for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with their opinion of the outcome of the war, some of which have to do, I believe, with their policies concerning Turkey and Qatar and the Gulf Rift, but I'll let them explain that in their reasoning. But there were other countries, Jordan and Egypt, Jordan in particular, that they wanted to re-engage with the Assad regime, not, I think, out of some sort of idea that the Assad regime was going to completely change its colors, but because Jordan is suffering as a result of the fact that Syria is isolated. A tremendous amount of overland trade used to go through Syria before the war, and they are home to such a tremendous number of refugees that it was understandable that they wanted to try and see where they could go. Also, they're incredibly exposed by a very long border, like Turkey, with that destabilized area. And of course, we had Egypt in the outlier, which also had its own reasons for re-engaging, some of which had to do with, I think, with their desire to engage more secular regimes. Also, I think, a desire concerning the Gulf Rift or a way they would play in it. But again, I'll let them speak for themselves. So the idea was, well, what is going to be the first carrots that will be dangled out for the Assad regime to go in a new direction? And the test case is the electricity and gas to Lebanon plan. As you'll know from reports that you can see in Arab media and beyond, the Jordanian government, King Abdullah himself, in his meetings with President Biden, has outlined a plan that would see, and that plan is, these maps are from an upcoming presentation from a report from the Washington Institute by a number of colleagues. This will outline both the electricity and gas grids that are in the Eastern Mediterranean. In short, and we'll go into a little bit of details perhaps a little bit later, Egypt is to increase the flow of gas from its fields and also Israeli feeds off the coast of Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula down through Aqaba. Right now, those transmissions are about 50 to 60 million cubic meters a day. Cubic feet a day. That powers one power plant at Aqaba. Since the beginning of the conflict, the flow of gas in the Arab gas pipeline, which was originally designed to go northward, has been going southward because during the war, Israel brought on the Leviathan field, and that massive field off its coast brings about 300 million cubic feet of gas to Jordan every day. And so one of the rules of pipelines is that the product can only run in one direction at a time if it's a single pipeline. And so in reality, via a connection in northern Jordan, the Arab gas pipeline has been running southward with Israeli gas for years, and that has been powering the main backbone of Jordan's generators. This was because the Egyptians could not move enough gas over during the course of the war. It was shut off after 2011 for a while, but also because Jordan could use this more efficiently. The idea was that the Lebanese, who are going through their own crisis based on their own internal problems, and most importantly concerning its electricity sector, were in such need of power that this test case would try and see if you could move electricity first from Jordan through Syrian territory into Lebanon. It is possible via transmission lines that are currently available to move about 700 megawatts a day from Jordan through Syrian territory into Lebanon. And there has been an initial agreement between the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Syrians to move about 400 megawatts a day. So this early test case is already quickly getting off the ground. It depends a lot on the transmission lines inside of Syria and so on, which I'll get into in a moment. A second, more vague phase of this plan involves something which is truly spectacular, in my opinion. It involves moving large amounts, potentially, of Israeli gas northward through Syrian territory and onward to Lebanon to generate power inside of Syria and eventually Lebanon for the Lebanese people. Anyone who has been working in the Middle East for a long time must feel tremendously old when you hear about a scheme, given everything that's happened in the history of the Middle East since 1948, to think that Israel could be funding or that could be fueling stations in the Syrian Arab Republic to send electricity throughout the Levant, most notably into Lebanon. But that indeed is the intention, and there have been a number of announcements of efforts inside of Syria to construct new energy plants and so on. Inside of Lebanon, the prospects for this plan are more limited, I think. There's one dual-fired station in the northern part of the country at Deir Ammar, which is capable of receiving gas, and the Arab gas pipeline is now there and is able to supply it. The only other dual-fired station is Zahrani in the south, which has no source of natural gas, and at least it won't for the foreseeable future. This test case was due to get off the ground, and there was an agreement, as I mentioned, between the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Syrian government. Early indications are that the World Bank would fund this project, although it's unclear whether it's going to be the infrastructure for this project or the energy itself. The problem with this is that, of course, the isolation campaign on Syria, as I mentioned, is supported by a very vigorous group of sanctions that are the most recent of which have been the Caesar sanctions on the Syrian regime for its humanitarian abuses throughout the war. And this is in marking the efforts of a Syrian photographer who smuggled horrific photographs that are right out of the Holocaust or the Third Reich out of Syria, showing badly tortured bodies and so on. It has massive secondary effects on the Syrian regime and anybody who does business with it. The administration from the top decided that these early electricity efforts, because they were humanitarian in nature, were not sanctionable and therefore could go around Syrian sanctions. They would not require a waiver or what we call a license in the government to supply this energy across Syrian territory to Lebanon, because it was for these humanitarian and altruistic reasons. Also, because the World Bank would be potentially funding it, the World Bank, in their view, is not an entity that is subject to sanctions because it's a type of international NGO. Now, these are interpretations of the Biden administration that we know so far. And while that legalistically might be true, the problem with it politically, and I think this is going to be a really big issue coming up in the not-too-distant future, is that while it might go around the law, at least for this early test case, the ability to expand it is very, very limited. And the reason why it's very, very limited is because this grid that you see behind me here, which I know is terribly complicated and looks and is for further discussion, if you take, this is one overlay. If you take the next slide, and if we could advance to the next one, please. This is the overlay that shows the transmission lines and the location of hospitals. So if there were only hospitals inside of Syria, supplying them with electricity under humanitarian purposes, and the threat of leakage of that electricity out to these facilities is not really a big deal, right? This is clearly within the realm of a humanitarian effort, and one that the United States would not stand in the way of, because we are concerned about the Syrian people. The problem is that these hospitals, while they are located and they are linked into this grid, are alongside, and we go to the next slide, please, the location of Syrian military bases, helicopter bases, and chemical weapons facilities. There's really no way to separate it from an analytical standpoint. There is not a separate grid that goes from Jordan through Syrian territory to Lebanon. In fact, they're interconnected grids with agreements that long predate the war. So while there's a technical carve-out from moving some power through Syrian territory to Lebanon to help in that emergency, the ability to expand it, I believe politically, and also I believe legally, is very, very limited. But if we look at the spirit of the Caesar sanctions themselves, which is very important in my opinion, and we go to the next and final slide, we can see here, these green dots are current regime detention facilities and prisons where they literally torture people to death on a daily basis, where they operate crematoriums in some cases. These facilities are ones that are also serviced by the Syrian grid. Because of these very practical reasons, the administration, I think, is kind of treading very, very carefully. They have, in recent days, reached out to the different parties in the Arab countries with some executive instructions, and you can see those on the Treasury Department website. They're extremely cautionatory, and while it could be regarded as a political green light from Washington to engage, I think the Arab parties are regarding it instead as an amber light or a yellow light. Much, much more cautious in trying to sort of understand where this is all going. But the final thing that I think perhaps calls this maybe into question, whether at least on the speed in which it would be implemented, is the recent most dramatic split between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Lebanese government, which has been in the press. I won't bore you with it, but has led to a serious downgrading, if not breaking of relations or near breaking of relations between many Gulf countries and Lebanon. The reason why this, of course, is important is that while the World Bank was willing to fund this program up front, it's the Arab Gulf countries that have the resources to fund a more permanent program that would move energy in this direction and help Lebanese and potentially Syrian people. And it's very clear after this split that the Arab Gulf countries are not in favor of that, and instead are taking a much more hands-off, if not isolationist approach to the government in Lebanon. So into this situation, and I'll end with this, I think the collapse in that situation has not only hurt this test case, but probably led to the most recent visit by the UAE foreign minister to Damascus, which was to some unexpected, but was the inevitable face of a very public policy to directly engage with the Assad regime. The problem with this, I think, and it goes along with what we've heard so far from all of the speakers, is that this kind of engagement, it is unclear exactly what kinds of concessions that Assad is going to make in order to get these carrots, to get around sanctions. But some of the really big ones that are on the table, in particular, do include Iran. There's been a long-standing effort to try and get Iranian-backed groups and Iranian missile systems and weapon systems out of Syria or back from particularly the Israeli frontier, which has been a major goal of that country. But not only that was to accelerate the long moribund process under 2254 to get the Constitutional Committee going, let alone getting towards elections and other kinds of substantial changes from the regime. The problem is the regime hasn't made any changes, or they've been so small to be hard to measure. And so I think the Biden administration's policy could very well remarkably be, in terms of its goals, to try and get those very concessions out of the Assad regime, albeit with these more limited carrots. And it seems that Russia's efforts with the United States and their more recent talks are trying to find a way to lead the regime in a different direction. The problem is the regime's position is a virulent kind of chauvinist position, maximalist in nature, which sees any kind of concession as some sort of catastrophic event that will lead to the ultimate collapse of the regime. But meanwhile, the fact is that while that policy worked in the years before the war, concerning the Arab-Israeli conflict and the different efforts to engage with Damascus over that, the kinds of nefarious activities the Assad regime has had to, or has taken on, which Joel outlined very clearly, to survive, including a chemical weapons program, a nuclear program, and most recently becoming a narco state. The fact is that the metrics have changed in Washington. This emergence of the Assad regime as a kind of North Korea on the Mediterranean, so to speak, means that even if we get beyond these initial engagements and these test cases, there's a long laundry list of behaviors that the Assad regime would need to take on in order to get out of this situation. So while we can't go back to the way Syria was before the war, I would agree, we also can't go back to the kind of diplomacy that predated the war, where feckless engagement with the regime ignored its behavior and did not lead to substantial concessions by Damascus. And I think it's actually important now, and I'll end with this, to look back at that period of time. Turkey played a role in those early stages to try and engage with the Assad regime to move it in a different direction. And as we know, that did not move in a positive direction for Turkey or for a lot of other parties. And so we need to draw some lessons and move forward, using the economic pressures that we build up and dangling out some carrots to lead Assad in a different direction, and then very closely watching it together as allies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for your talk. I know you might have some questions to our panelists, but just be patient for about 10-15 minutes. We will give the floor to Richard Outzen, long-term military career, then turned into diplomat. So, Richard, please. Then we will go for Q&A session.
Always a challenge to be the last one to speak. There we go. Always a challenge to be the last one to speak, as everyone wants to get to the questions and sometimes to the coffee and so forth. So I will try to be relatively brief with my comments. What a great honor it is to be here. I'm a long-term participant in and supporter of Turkish-U.S. bilateral relations, defense relations, diplomatic relations, especially as they relate to Syria, which is something so near and dear to the hearts of the people here. And For countries that have had a close strategic relationship now for well over 70 years, the United States and Turkey have a surprisingly small amount of strategic dialogue on things, both at the official level, then there are some strategic level meetings that happen every year, but even think tank to think tank, people to people, there's not enough contact, there's not enough discussion of this sort. And frankly, we come at the issues from different perspectives. We need to realize that. And we need to talk those perspectives out in order to reach a basis for mutual action. So to me, if there's one thing you remember from the panel, it's that we need more of this. And I want to thank ORSAM especially for putting this together. And with the president of ORSAM, Ahmet Uysal, Numan and Oytun, also from the organization, thank you for the roles you played in this. Ambassador Jeffrey and my dear friend Ambassador Selçuk Ünal, who's also here from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and all the people here. This is a very important type of strategic dialogue to help create ideas and a basis for mutual action. So I'm proud to be here and proud to be a part of that. There are three things I want to discuss, just three. Stasis, drift, and end games. By stasis, what I mean is that we are in a sort of locked-in status quo now. That's not all bad, because if you take our policy back a few years, remember what a disaster Syria policy was, not just for the United States, but chaotic policy 2013, 14, 15 for much of the international community. Why? Because there was a huge gap, what we call sometimes in the United States the say-do gap, between what the international community was saying about Syria and what the international community was doing about Syria. Because we all said sort of the right things. We recognized the shockingly and uniquely evil nature of the Assad regime early on, that this was a regime that was slaughtering its own people, that was engaging in mass demographic change, that was pursuing chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, and that, by the way, while we were trying to stabilize Iraq, was sending a steady flow of terrorist fighters to try to fight and kill Americans in Iraq, similar to what it had done by supporting the Pkk during the long years of Hafez al-Assad's reign, while they supported Pkk actions against Turkey. This is the quintessential rogue regime. So seeing that it was engaged in this paroxysm of the rightful longings of the Syrian people to be free from such a regime, we all said the right things, that the regime should go. And there was a sort of rhetorical support to the people of Syria to engage in the revolution. But revolution is hard, and overthrowing dictatorships is hard. Coercive diplomacy is hard. And the countries, especially the United States, but also its other allies, that had engaged in trying to change evil regimes, dictatorial regimes in Iraq and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, had no appetite for another major war to force that sort of thing in Syria. So we were left with imperfect tools. And you remember what that led to. It was a massive tension between what we were saying and what we were doing. And that played out, especially after the Russians jumped in, increasingly in 2015, in the bad actors in this scenario applying more and more real pressure and real leverage while the West dithered. And while the West talked about supporting opposition and talked about relieving the humanitarian situation and talked about Assad going, but did a decreasing amount of work to actually make that happen. I sometimes relate the United States and Turkey during this period, which are two countries with massive interests in Syria, to two men approaching a door, and the first man saying, "You, please, first," and the other man saying, "No, I insist, you first." And this dialogue went on for several years. Because the truth is, neither the United States nor Turkey, for different reasons, was very anxious in 2013, 14, and 15 to jump in fully. Now, if you could have jumped ahead to 2016, 17, 18, back with the eyes of 2013 or 2012 and said, by the way, Turkey will have 10,000 or more troops in Syria and control a large swath of territory and responsible for over 5 million Syrians in Syria, let alone the 4 million who are in Turkey. Oh, and by the way, the United States, at some point, you'll have several thousand troops in Syria as well, and you will be actively engaged in combat operations, not just against ISIS, but on occasion against mercenaries who tried to, and terrorists who tried to attack our bases and things as well. Then maybe that conversation would have been different. But that initial period became unsupportable because the Russians and Syrians finally understood that neither the United States nor Turkey, nor the two of them together, nor the Gulf countries that were supporting the opposition at the time, were working in coordination. a lack of coordination that in some ways continues today. So what happened was Turkey on its path and the United States in its path, in parallel with occasional consultation, engaged in more direct intervention. We increasingly, through reliance on a local force, the Ypg, Turkey, by turning what had been the Free Syrian Army into the Syrian National Army and working in conjunction with them. Certain things were achieved by that. We had to manage great tensions between the two countries on these parallel paths because of the different modalities we took. But I will give some praise to the team, especially under the Trump administration, that arrested on the U.S. side the very sharp deterioration of the position in Syria. Because after the United States had delivered very heavy blows against ISIS, which was our main priority, we were watching the gradual wresting of control by the Assad regime of opposition-held territories. Because while we were busy with Daesh, Assad was busy attacking and destroying much of the opposition. So we saw the fall of Aleppo. We saw the creation with the Russians of these so-called de-escalation zones, which in reality were also gradually conquered by the Russians and the Syrian forces and the Iranian forces. That was an unsustainable status quo. What happened after a period of policy review in 2017 during the last administration, the Trump administration, and some of the people here with us today, especially Ambassador Jeffrey and Joel Rayburn, had a very important role in informing the senior decision makers at the beginning of the Trump administration that that policy could not continue because the waves of millions of refugees, the humanitarian disaster, the growth of Iranian power, the suffering of the Syrian people, and the damage to Turkish and U.S. interests would only magnify and continue. So we put on a max pressure campaign that included some of the sticks that we talked about before. And it was, in a sense, a success of what we sometimes refer to as coercive diplomacy, in that by using a limited amount of military force with some diplomatic coordination and economic sanctions, we were able to deter the regime from coming in any further. By the way, it would have been impossible to do that without Turkey, because Turkey was a strong military deterrent as well to the Assad regime, for instance, coming into the Euphrates Shield area, which it had liberated from ISIS control and prevented the regime from coming into. Similarly to what it did in 2020 in Idlib by preventing the Syrians and the Iranians from retaking that territory. Turkey has shed blood to protect that status quo, as have we. It's not a perfect status quo, and it's a status quo in which we have some difficulties with one another because of what's east of the Euphrates and what's west of the Euphrates. But that status quo is far better, let us remember, than what had pertained prior to the U.S. and Turkey getting involved in that way. So that's the first part. That's all the stasis that was achieved, which was the arrest of, or the arresting of a very bad deterioration with humanitarian consequence. The second point is drift. And by drift, I mean that right now, similar to what we went through in the first year of the Trump administration, the current administration has had a period of review of its policy. Now, unfortunately, this is sort of a design flaw in the U.S. policy-making architecture, if you will. We really don't get much done in the first year of presidential administrations. Why? Because you're getting people appointed to positions, you're getting a congressional and normally Senate approval of key people, and there's a review, especially if it's switched from one party to another, as we determine what direction the new policy will take. The problem is that the status quo or stasis that had been achieved had a constant maintenance requirement. That maintenance requirement is embodied in Ambassador Jeffrey. He was making public statements. He was engaging in multilateral diplomacy. He was engaging in bilateral diplomacy with Turkish counterparts and with others. He was talking with the Department of Defense to make sure that our civilian and military arms were linked up. When you don't have that policy clarity, there is a drift. And frankly, there has been a lag over the last year in the multilateral diplomacy. For instance, the small group that is an important coordinating mechanism between the U.S. and some of its allies. And that was essentially the Trump administration's approach. We did a certain number of countries through the small group, and then we had a very direct bilateral channel with Turkey. Both of those have slowed. I'm not saying nothing's going on, but what I'm saying is, and there's an old U.S. saying that if we don't hang apart, we'll hang, or if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. And that's part of the problem here, is that in the case of Turkey and the United States, and also some European and regional allies that want the right thing, a good outcome for the Syrian people. We are hanging separately because we're not coordinating those efforts, and part of that is a function of this drift in multilateral policy and management and diplomacy by the United States and some of its key allies. So that won't continue forever. And I will say that I don't think some of the worst fears that a Turkish audience would have about the United States policy, I don't see those coming. If I was a Turk, I think I would be afraid that the Americans are making some secret deal, either with Assad or with the Russians, to get out and to trade something, right? Something that's going to badly prejudice Turkey's interests. First of all, I just don't think we're that clever, right? There are other countries, and the Russians would probably be one of them, maybe the Iranians, who make that sort of deal. I don't think we're clever in that way. And the truth of the matter is we really don't want to prejudice Turkey's long-term security interests. So I realize there's a perception, not unwarranted, in Turkey that some of what we have done and how we pursued our interests in Syria prejudiced Turkey's interests. However, as a long-term proposition, what we do want is a stable Syrian state under better management that does not pose a threat to its neighbors, and that includes Turkey. And one of the reasons, as much as the Americans don't want to be involved in this, other than the Syria fight against ISIS, one of the reasons we don't want to be managing things like we tried to in places like Iraq and Afghanistan is it's very complicated and needs multilateral support. But we can't back away from it either, because at the end of the day, Israel matters to us a lot, and we can't have Iranians on the Golan, for instance, and Turkey matters to us a lot, and we can't have Turkey destabilized. And people, the decision makers in the Biden administration, as well as the Trump administration, appreciate that, despite all the frictions that we have had. Now, that drift will come to an end. What's going to look like from here? I think there's a tendency also in Washington to look at things in sort of a unidirectional, as if the U.S. process that gives us a policy direction, that's really the only important thing. And then afterwards, we just have to get people on our little vector that we're going on. The truth is more complicated. We have to understand the other vectors that the other players are going on. Now, I find it a useful exercise to look at all the key stakeholders in the Syrian conflict and ask yourself the question, what leverage do they have? What end state must they have? And what is the trade space? So when we look at that, I think we come into two groupings here, and the groupings are suggestive of the best direction both for Turkish and for American policy. So the first grouping is the grouping of countries who have an interest long-term in a weak Syrian state or in sort of a shell of a Syrian state. The Iranians first come to mind here. Why? Because, and I'm going to quote a Turkish diplomat, not Ambassador Ünal, but another, who told me about a conversation he had with an Iranian colleague once, who said, "You Turks are masters at working within order and managing order." He said, "We Iranians are masters at creating chaos and managing chaos." There are many examples of that. Lebanon is one, but Syria is another good example. And frankly, Syria has come in its pathologies in many ways to resemble Lebanon. And the Iranians love this because they're able to create local sources of their own control, both by investing in sort of religious initiatives and social initiatives, building certain things that are rewarding to their clients, and frankly insinuating themselves into the military and intelligence apparatus of Syria. That's good for the Iranians because it essentially gives them subterranean control of the state. Who else benefits from a sort of a broken Syrian state? Well, frankly, Bashar al-Assad does. Why? Because he still is the putative head of a majority Sunni state. He has a problem. He has a problem because most of the people there do not see him as a legitimate president. So he has to have a country in which he diminishes the size and the influence of the Sunni population. Having 5 million or 6 million stay in perpetual overseas refuge is one part of that. But the other part is marginalizing and hammering the Sunni communities that remain. So this means he's essentially at war with his own population. And this is probably a less popular argument to make in Turkey, but he has a similar or parallel issue with the Kurds of northeast Syria. Because he also wants to have quiescent, not politically represented Syrian Kurdish population that is subordinate to the regime. Now, I'm of the opinion that the PYD is not the only solution for political representation to the Kurds of northeast Syria. And one of the things that we've pushed for is for other voices, other Kurdish voices, some of which are on very good terms with Turkey, to be a part of that political dialogue as well. And that has to be part of it. By the way, the Russians are a third party that falls into this category because the Russians love their frozen conflicts. They in Transnistria, in the Ukraine, in Georgia, having a country that's semi-broken where they control part of it is good enough for them. And the costs of restoring sovereignty, unity, and functionality to a state are more than the Russians are willing to pay in any of these places. It's diplomatically difficult, it's expensive, and it puts them at the center of the military conflict. So I don't see any reason why Syria is any different for them. They have no real reason, as long as they control via Assad, who they see as an effective proxy, what they call useful Syria, you know, the backbone of the major Western cities from Aleppo on down. They really don't care about the periphery. Now you put that on the other side of the countries who have interests that are in a functioning state that is not a threat to its neighbors. That requires a sovereign and effective and fairly accountable government. And the United States and Turkey both need that. Because Turkey's long-term interest, not having a terror threat coming into or along its borders, not having massive new population flows, most of the things that Oytun has already discussed, and not having a Pkk threat that's resident in and instrumentalized by the regime in Damascus. These all require that you have a functioning state. There is also the issue, the fact that Turkey has now a long-standing relationship with the Sunni opposition and needs some guarantees that under any agreement, even if most of those people or some of them go back to Syria, that they won't be killed, or that they won't be oppressed in the same ways that led to the revolution in the first part. All of this requires a functioning state. Now, when it comes to the other part of the equation, leverage that we have to pursue these goals, actually Turkey's in a pretty good position. Turkey has a long border. It has a dominant economic position with regards to transit and trade into and out of Syria. It has millions, I think 4 million Syrians at least, by official numbers, living in Turkey, hopefully some of whom will one day be able to go back to their homelands. It has a support relationship with another 5 million or so that are living in Syria. It has an effective and capable military. It's got the resources to deal with this problem, and if necessary, I think Turkey's got the staying power. I know Turks don't want to stay in Syria any longer than they have to, but I don't see why they couldn't stay for a decade or more if it takes that long to get this worked out. That's huge leverage. The United States has leverage because we are still the leaders in a sense of the diplomatic and financial worlds, and when there is a solution, one that we bless as legitimate, and that our other allies bless as legitimate, then the true resources for reconstruction and for stabilization will open up, and that's an important form of leverage. Now, the Russians and the Iranians have some leverage on the ground. They have control, and the invitation from Assad essentially to own a portion of Syrian sovereignty. That's what Assad has done. He has handed over portions of Syrian sovereignty to these outside players. That's an important form of leverage. Let's recognize that. So again, looking at the leverage that each player has, and Assad's trying to balance all of this, and probably even balance the Iranians off against the Russians in a sense, as well as the other Arabs. It is a very complicated leverage game with very little trade space. But I think ultimately what comes from this is the realization that the United States and Turkey, for all the problems that we have had, especially over modalities and tactical approaches, the end games are consistent with what we want. And frankly, it's consistent with most of what's good for the Syrian people. It is not possible for me to see how our end games are consistent with either the Assad regime or the Iranians. There might be some overlap with the Russians, and I think between this careful balancing game that Turkey has done through the Astana process as well, there is a way to get at least tacit Russian approval for some things that will protect our long-term interest and Turkey's long-term interest. But it's a tightrope that we have to walk here. So I guess what I want to see as we get towards the end of 2021 is a much more intense effort at the official level, but also, as I said at the beginning, at the academic and think tank level to generate examination of this shared space that we have and the trade space in US and Turkish policy to better coordinate. We did not coordinate effectively at all 2011 through 2016. 2016 to 2019 or 2020, we coordinated tensely but effectively. We have to enter a new stage. We, I think, are the two biggest exogenous factors in the equation of what happens in Syria. Let's use that. But it's going to take a better and more effective form of coordination than what we've seen to date. That's my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for this very well productive presentation. Now we will go for Q&A session, and I would like to invite Professor Ahmed and Ambassador Jeffrey to the floor again, because there might be some questions also from the audience to you. So, my friends, please arrange the floor in a few minutes. Just a second. No, they'll arrange.
Okay.
We will have, I know we are a bit late, but we will have maybe 30 minutes for Q&A, maximum, I hope. So, please. Yes. Floor is yours now, maybe, if there are any questions. Mr. Saifan, please. Microphone here first. Anand.
Working? It's okay. Thank you for all speakers. Actually, it was very informative, a lot of ideas. First of all, it is a very important occasion. Just I want to ask Mr. Jeffrey, he mentioned several difficulties, problems in Syria, not nur the people killed, the damage, the reconstruction, the chemical, the refugees, the drugs, etc. And all of these questions couldn't be solved unless the regime will go, Bashar al-Assad and his regime. But at the same time, Mr. Jeffrey, Mr. Raibon, Mr. Tepler, you are speaking about the changing regime behavior. What does it mean, changing regime behavior? Do you think the regime is able to change its behavior in any way after all these times, or it is illusion? Mr. Aiton discussed or he spoke about kind of deal between Russia and USA, and he gives some hints about this deal. Do you think this deal is going to be rehabilitation of the regime, to normalize the regime, to accept the regime? Do you have any ideas, or just this is... Mr. Jeffrey and Mr. Oysal, they spoke about very important issue, that the cooperation between Turkey and USA could play a very important role to push towards political solution, fair political solution. Could be the solution is going to the end of kind of deal with Russia, that Russia accept also to helping in political solution based on political transition without al-Assad, and from other side to stop the sanction, to help the reconstruction, and to guarantee the interest of Russia in Syria, this idea could be possible out to work on it between Russia, between USA and Turkey, as they are two key players in the Syrian struggle. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Your first and your third questions to me, in a way, are kind of the same question, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. It's quite conceivable, and we worked hard both with all of our partners and friends, including Turkey, but also with the Russians, in laying out what we needed to the Assad regime to do at various stages to get the lifting of some sanctions, more diplomatic recognition, ultimately the withdrawal of foreign forces at the end of a process. The core of it was adhering to UN Security Council Resolution 2254. But various other things. On the nuclear account, the Syrian government has signed agreements in 2013 that it is violating. It just has to start doing them again. It's not impossible to see a change in the attitude of a government towards the people it's driven away that would allow them to come back. It may not be, and I'll get to this in a second, Assad is unwilling to do this, but it certainly is, in terms of what it would take to do, international guarantees, international funding, and the international community would be happy. I mean, do you have any idea how much money we're spending on humanitarian assistance for Syria? Turkey alone, I think it's over $40 billion for the refugees, 3 million refugees you have there. Well, that's only 1/4 of the people who've left. The United States has put $11 billion into humanitarian assistance since 2011. The European Union and European countries at least double that. It's pushing $100 billion of assistance, and it will go on forever unless we get a solution to this, so that there would be money to help the Syrian people reconcile themselves if the government would accept it. And in terms of the Iranian presence, particularly the Iranian offensive presence, I see no reason why an Assad regime supported by the Russians, and the Russians have no interest in Iranian long-range systems in Syria, could push them out. Again, this would not require a change in the regime, new leadership, breaking up its overall relationships with Russia and Iran that they relied upon in the civil war. But I could see them taking various steps, fighting Daesh. We offered to be much more supportive, helping the Russians and the Syrians who are having a tough time fighting Daesh in their areas. This is something that we could coordinate and do in a week, if they would agree to it. So there's various things that they could do without changing the very nature of the regime. Problem is, we have seen no willingness, and here you're right, for Assad to take these steps. Would Russia like Assad to take at least some of these steps? I think so, because while it is not a major burden on Russia, there are risks and costs to continuing on in a frozen conflict like this. Russia has other problems and issues. Iran, less so, and that's a problem between Russia and Iran. But at the end of the day, the one benefit of our policy is, even if we don't get Assad to change, is that Assad, Russia, and Iran do not win. That would mean not just all of these problems that I've sketched out would continue, but you would have a geopolitical shift in the whole region towards disorder. Look at Yemen, look at Iraq, the attack on the Prime Minister, look at Syria, good grief, look at Lebanon. On the other hand, look at Libya. While the situation isn't perfect there, while many outside forces were in Libya 2 years ago, and Turkey fought a minor war there, essentially against Russian surrogates. But the point is, the international community, we can see a way forward in Libya, because we do not have this extraordinary Iranian presence. In these other 4 places, you do. So therefore, it is really important that the Iranian project not get another victory. And that's worth holding the line against any concessions to the Assad regime or to its supporters without them taking those steps to deal with these problems that are real security concerns for you, for Jordan, for Israel, for the rest of the Arab League, for the Europeans, for the UN system. Thank you.
May I add something? Mr. Jeffrey, I think both the U.S. and Turkey has some leverage on Russia, maybe pressure Russia to somehow open the way for like constitutional committee and political transition, especially Russia after the fake elections of late. Russia said, you know, we can repeat the elections anytime, and somehow they recognize that it is not a real election. So it is a matter of pressure and maybe give and take, or also maybe other files like Libya, Caucasia, Crimea, or like now the Europeans locked in Belarus with Russians. You know, I think it's more complicated, but can be done. Maybe give from somewhere and take from somewhere. And Turkey also has some, you know, pressure, potential leverage on Russia, but I think should be more coordinated.
I'd like to comment on that because we did see considerable debate within Russia at the highest levels about the path to take. In the end, they did not take the path of a compromise solution that we offered at every level. I think part of the reason is that, and this is why I'm somewhat more hopeful now, they were not sure that President Trump himself was committed to keeping troops on in Syria. And as we heard earlier, the presence of American troops is crucial not only for the America's role in Syria. In various ways, I think it is an important complement to the Turkish military role, the Israeli military role, the role of the Arab League, the role of the Europeans, the role of the UN. And therefore, the Russians were hoping that we withdraw our forces. As our forces were ordered to withdraw twice, it was not an unreasonable assumption. As it happens, they're still there. Now, we are quite sure, to the extent we can read the minds of this administration, they will stay on. That means 3 years of stability with a president who appears committed to keep these troops on in Syria and Iraq, and thus more of an opportunity to make the same points we made to the Russians, but that has to be made on the basis of no American concessions without our UN concessions or Arab concessions or anybody else's concessions without steps taken by the other side. One-sided concessions, as we've just seen in Yemen, do not yield Iranian acquiescence or Iranian flexibility.
Yes.
If I could just add to those comments for my old friend Samir, who I know from long ago in Syria when both of us were younger men. I think in terms of your question is, are these changes the equivalent of or tantamount to the fall of the regime? And I would argue that they're not. However, to your point, I think the regime regards domestic reforms as a threat to the way it rules, the arbitrary nature, the tyrannical nature of the regime, because it has proven unable to reform internally. That's a challenge. That's a challenge for the Russians. That's their job in all of this, not our job. But in terms of the regime's behavior, even before the war, there have been instances in the past when international pressure and sometimes military pressure and diplomatic pressure has yielded results with Damascus. And a few of them, probably the most famous, was the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon in 2005. I witnessed that. I know, Samir, you did as well, and many of you in the audience. That was an unexpected outcome of the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. But there were lots of other instances where the Syrian regime would, for example, make modifications on the Syrian frontier concerning its security there. Granted, it didn't last very long. Handing over certain wanted terrorists or those that were opposing the United States in Iraq, was another instance. There were also on and off negotiations for years concerning the relationship between Hezbollah and the Syrian regime and the flow of weapons there, and certain outcomes in Lebanon which predate that. So there is some precedent for that. What there is not precedent for are the domestic reforms. That's the really hard work. But it's a different situation. We have a divided country. We have different zones of influence. But to be honest with you, I think the regime can get into a negotiating standpoint fairly quickly because, as you know, many Syrian oppositionists, what they call the loyal opposition, or those that are close to the regime, still reside inside of Syria. They could launch a domestic campaign to go in a different direction with an idea of picking off or leading other oppositionists outside to go along with them. But so far they haven't done that. And I think this is one of the key elements for the Russians to raise with the regime.
Just one quick, then Mr. Andrew. Yeah, I think it's a good point that Hariri assassination caused Syria exit from Lebanon, but you have more disastrous explosion of the whole Beirut, what do you call it? Port, yeah. I mean, it's like half of the city almost destroyed, and there is an effort to hinder the investigations and also legal process. It would be a big push or on pressure on maybe Iranian and Assad-related forces in Lebanon and in Syria also or overall Iranian influence.
Let me answer that. That whole history after 2005 and 2006 shows the staying power not of Syria, which is the question here, but of Iran and Hezbollah, having worked part of that, the 2006 war, and in particular the 2008 internecine fighting within Syria, where Hezbollah took on the other political groups. Syria was not involved. But another example, of course, a famous one here is the ejection of Abdullah Öcalan from Syria and the Adana Agreement, where Syria gave an extraordinary set of rights to the Turkish military to operate on Syrian territory. Why did that happen? Because of pressure and serious belief in Damascus that that pressure would only get worse if they didn't compromise. That's, in a nutshell, the example we were trying to follow when we were doing this.
So any other question?
Hi, I am Recep from ORSAM. First of all, welcome to Turkey and thank you all for your great presentations. I have a question for Joel Rayburn. Mr. Rayburn, it's clear by now that you are a vocal critic of Arab normalization efforts with the Assad regime. You think that it's not a good idea to normalize with Assad after all he's done to his people. But right now, what we see is a situation in which the U.S. administration isn't trying hard enough to hinder these efforts. The team Biden is not doing much to prevent these normalization efforts. And why do you think this is the case? And why is the Biden administration become so tolerant of the Assad regime right now? And what does it tell us about the new U.S. policy on Syria? Thank you.
That's a good question, and this is the topic of conversation amongst all the Syria hands in Washington all the time. I think, part of it is that, as Rich Outson pointed out, it's only recently, and Andrew mentioned this too, it's only recently that the Biden administration completed its internal policy review, and to be fair to them, the Trump administration spent the first year in office almost coming up with and arguing about hashing out a formal Syria policy internally. And Rich Outson had a big hand in actually formulating that. So it wasn't until Secretary Tillerson's speech at Stanford in January 2018 that the Trump administration was able to announce a comprehensive Syria policy. So in the absence of a comprehensive Syria policy, I think a lot of diplomats, diplomats need instructions. They need to know what is the bigger picture that they're supposed to be supporting. So I think there's been a bit of an absence of that bigger idea on U.S. policy over the last year. Now, in addition, once you have the idea in place, then you can build a team that can be active every day. In the Trump administration, it took us 1.5 years to get to that point, where we had a single sort of address inside the executive branch of the U.S. government that was carrying out Syria policy, and then, of course, we were able to move with alacrity. Now, what I would say is we haven't seen that yet out of the Biden administration. It's absolutely true. And there have been some mixed messages, some mixed signals coming out of the Biden administration. Hopefully, those will be cleared up now that they have, everybody has the instruction manual for their Syria policy. But I would go beyond that, and I would say, even if there are some voices here and there in Washington or elsewhere in the United States that are tired of the Syria conflict, or they don't see a big problem with normalization, I would say that that's not the mood of broader Washington, broader United States at all. I spent 7 months almost working in the Congress this year after leaving the State Department, and I can tell you that the mood in the Congress still is decidedly in favor of a tough policy against the Syrian regime and its allies. All of those elements that created the Caesar Act, I think that sentiment is still there very strongly in Congress, and I think if you were to see a U.S. government go for too long without fulfilling the objectives of the Caesar Act, I think you would get you'd be more and more likely to see congressional oversight intervene in that situation to try to shape U.S. policy in a stronger way. I saw that firsthand myself inside the Congress.
The administration's argument is often in this regard, well, this is all for humanitarian purposes. There's two problems with that argument. That is what we just saw about the gas and electricity, some of the concessions made for the extension and much welcomed extension of the Idlib crossing from Turkey at the UN Security Council last July, and so forth. But there's two problems with that. First of all, the root of the horrific humanitarian problems in Syria is the Assad regime's war on its own people, as you heard earlier. That's the first thing. And that is not going to go away by making concessions for any reason. The second thing is, and we see this a little bit with a similar argument made in our policy in Yemen, making concessions for humanitarian reasons can serve as an excuse for almost any change of policy, potentially for other different reasons. That's my problem with this. It is opening the door to releasing, how can I put it, easing the pressure on the Assad regime to make the kind of things, to do the kind of things they did in Lebanon in 2005 and they did with Turkey in, 1998, on the basis of, well, we have to do this for humanitarian reasons. And then the pressure goes away and you still have the problem.
Let me add one point. There's a third and technical problem with the rationale that humanitarian imperatives require a lessening of pressure on the Assad regime, specifically on the electricity and gas arrangement that Andrew described. Essentially, that's a situation where there are some people saying, well, we need to allow a violation of the Caesar Act for the humanitarian good of the people of Lebanon. Now, the Caesar Act has humanitarian exemptions. It's for the people of Syria. It's not for the people of Lebanon. So there is a legal problem with this argument. And if there's any kind of gray area amongst the lawyers inside the U.S. government on this point, I think it will be cleared up in the coming months by the Congress. If not in 2022, then in 2023. If you were to accept the argument that the humanitarian situation in Lebanon requires you to stop enforcing sanctions that pertain to Syria, then it could be the humanitarian imperatives in Paraguay or Micronesia or Andorra or somewhere else, Australia or the North Pole, might require you to lessen the pressure on Syria. You can construct any kind of daisy chain. If you open the gate to that argument, it's a slippery slope to arguing that, well, maybe it's the interests of the people of Iraq, or maybe it's the interests of the people of the Gulf, or maybe it's the interests of the people of Egypt or wherever, Timbuktu. So that's a legal problem that this deal is going to run into. And I think the people who are considering sponsoring it or participating in it are going to need to take that into serious consideration.
Just quick, this allowing or breaking the Caesar Act for humanitarian maybe also sets a negative precedence for, Assad. He would think that, creating more humanitarian chaos would open him, some doors, but even back doors to more of legitimacy. So we should be careful on that, I think. Yes, question?
Hi, my question is for Mr. Utzon. For the majority of Syrian people, Turkey is very important to us. Turkey is one of the closest allies. Turkey is one of the very few countries that have stood by the Syrian people. My question to you is, what can the United States government do to empower Turkey against its adversaries, such as Pkk, such as Russia, such as Iran? We feel, as Syrians, that Turkey is being left alone to fight the battle, and I would like to know, what can the United States government do to empower Turkey into making stronger decisions, more firm, more stern? How can they feel that their back is supported? Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. That's a great question. The U.S. actually has a fairly positive history over the long term of supporting Turkey in its efforts against the Pkk. And there was a mention earlier about Attila Ateş threatening to go to Damascus, which led to the Hafez al-Assad government kicking out Öcalan back in the 90s. Well, that was not the end of the story, of course. The end of the story is when he was caught in Africa. And the rumor has it that was the result of collaboration between the United States and Turkey. So certainly the Pkk has stated that they believe that to be true as well. The United States has also provided financial support to trying to end the financing activities of the Pkk in Europe. They listed the Pkk, of course, as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO designation that is still valid. And so we have to keep that in mind. Now, the distinction that the United States makes, that Washington makes, between PYD and YPG on the one hand, as Syrian organizations, and the Pkk, to people who in Turkey and elsewhere who have studied the organizations in detail, is not convincing. We'll say that. But it was allowed to be reflected in our policy because of exigent circumstances. Namely, there were Americans getting killed in Syria by Daesh. And Americans did not want to send American troops. This is 2013, 14, 15. You probably know the history of it. PYD, YPG were in fact fighting ISIS at the time, or groups that would become ISIS and were related to ISIS. So it was a relationship that grew out of a threat to the United States that is now moderated somewhat, especially because of President Trump's very aggressive efforts to destroy the ISIS caliphate after everybody sort of misplayed that in the early years, calling them the JV team and things like that. Turkey also suffered from ISIS terrorism and took great efforts to inflict losses on ISIS and help take territory from ISIS as well. The problem is we still have this legacy which looks very much to Ankara like U.S. support of a Pkk affiliate. And again, it's hard, people can change the subject on that. It's very hard to refute the substance of that. Now, the answer is not to go back and undo it, because in fact, that happened. That was how policy played out in 16, 17, 18. What what we can do about that is to press for, first of all, resolution of this conflict, because the YPG's role and value to the West is a product of the civil war in Syria. The U.S. has no political interest in the creation of some sort of PKK statelet. We've said that many, many times. We don't endorse their politics, we don't endorse their ideology, and long term, I don't think anybody in the United States thinks that project is reflective of what's best for the Syrian people. However, there's a huge amount of sympathy for the Syrian Kurds, as for other Syrians, because of the dramatic things they've gone through. So I think what the United States can do is to provide a political pathway, or at least engage in discussions about a political pathway for how the people of northeast Syria get beyond a wartime economy and a wartime polity. The wartime polity is ruled by this group. It's a de facto rule that we don't formally endorse, but in practical terms we don't oppose. That has to change. There has to be elections. There has to be 2254 implementation. Within the context of 2254, all the Syrian people, including the people of northeast Syria, Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, others, will have a representative government, and I'm 100% sure that that will not be dominated by PYD in the way that it is now. And that threat then, that Turkey perceives, with some justice, coming from that control that they have, that is a remnant or an artifact of this period of the civil war and the revolution, will end. I think that's the biggest problem. I mean, there's other problems in the U.S.-Turkish relationship, but this one here that stems from how we prosecuted our interests for some reasons that make sense to Americans, and how that endangered Turkey's interests, that has to be built down over time through a political pathway that we are very sensitive to Turkey's requirements in the process of pursuing. And I think we can do that, and I think it's headed that way. Everything that we do in support of 2254 also supports this goal of reducing that group's monopoly, de facto monopoly, on the politics of northeast Syria. That's the pathway to reduce it. Now, the other thing is, look, Turkey has some realistic defense requirements like F-16 modernization that have been discussed and that's being examined in the U.S. government. There's concerns in Congress over the S-400 that complicate things a little bit, but I personally think that the United States, and I hope that the Congress does this, I hope that the United States government does this, I know there's good people in our government working towards this, finds a way to support that. It's good for Turkey's defense capabilities, it's good for U.S. business. The modernization of Turkey's F-16s will help Turkey, it will help U.S. businesses, and it will help reconverge the two defense establishments. It would be a great sign that even though we've done some things that hurt each other, especially the U.S. hurting Turkey over the last couple of years, that we're still allies. And there's a fundamental dimension to that relationship that we have not quit and we won't be quitting. That's how I think we can help.
Okay, just final question. Is there is?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask the final question. On the humanitarian concessions, I think the danger is going further by labeling it under the economic recoveries waivers. So now the discussion is not just on humanitarian, but redefining economic recovery in a very broad and fluid, so that brings forward many more dangers. I wanted to ask about, and I think maybe Joel can answer that, what happens to JCPOA if it doesn't happen? I mean, since the Biden administration took office, there was so much emphasis on getting this deal done in August, in July, then August, then September, then there's talk now of what if it doesn't happen, what happens to Syria as being a function of, an unfortunate function of the JCPOA. The other question, and maybe Richard, Mr. Otson mentioned about, the YPG and potential. How do you think there could be a potential way out? And maybe you mentioned a few things, but I wanted to push it a little bit further in terms of a northeast, northwest reapproachment per se. What could be measures of goodwill, perhaps between the U.S. and Turkey? What can Syrians also play on that on multiple levels? Thank you very much again.
On okay, your question on the JCPOA. In other words, I think what you're asking is that since there's a very strong sense among Syrians and in DC, I think that in 2015 a tough policy against Assad was softened in the interest of not creating more, of reducing friction between the U.S. and the Iranian regime so that the JCPOA could be made to happen. And I know Syrians have been concerned over the last year that with the new U.S. administration seeking to revive the JCPOA, that might happen again, that the Syrian opposition might be treated as a card that could be played, given up to the Iranian regime, or that pressure would be brought off of Assad in the interests of making the Iranians happy enough to go back into the nuclear agreement. My own personal opinion is that nuclear agreement is not going to happen. The Iranians have gotten that the concessions, unfortunately, the U.S. side gave up too much of its leverage in advance in the interest of trying to have some confidence-building measures, and that over time there was an erosion of the enforcement of the economic pressure against the Iranian regime, and now it's able to export enough oil in evasion of sanctions to buyers like China that it feels comfortable enough not to enter back into the deal. And the elements of the deal as they were negotiated before, most of them are about to expire anyway. So the incentives for the Iranian regime to go back into the agreement are few and waning. But I would defer to Ambassador Jeffrey on Ambassador Jeffrey, I think, is tracking this more closely than probably any of us on what the prospects for a revived deal would be.
Very quickly, we may have sounded a bit too critical of the current administration Syria policy, because we are the last administration Syria policy, and we really liked our policy, if not everybody did. But here's the good news. I tried to be a little bit optimistic in explaining that we've got 3 years, and we think we've got an administration that, as Joel said, as they're coming together, and they seem finally to be, it's pretty sure that Biden is not a guy who makes very rapid turns. You might say Afghanistan, he was clear 11 years ago he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. This was nothing new, and he was following the Trump administration's policies largely as well. So,
but he blame on you on Afghanistan.
Well, sure, but that's just politics. The point is, if I looked at the top 10 things we were doing 2 years ago on Syria, all of these things are still being done by the Biden administration. The few differences, they don't have a senior person as Syria envoy. They canceled the oil contract. These are not going to the substance of it. The main problem, and that's where events like this, the media and friendly governments can help, is to get folks, to get this administration to go on record at a high level with what I just received as background that we've passed on to you, what, as Joel and others mentioned a couple of days ago, Shak al-Assad in London heard from the administration and such of what their policy is. Until that policy is clear and on the record on something as complicated as this, there'll be at least suspicions that the humanitarian argument or other arguments will be used to do different policies for different people. So the main concern right now is not the direction of the policy, it's that we need this policy to really work, to be explained to everyone around the region, to the American public who are putting troops on the ground, and to others, so that we can be sure that it is a consistent policy. In and of itself, all of the things I feared have not come to pass. But it would, as long as we don't know for sure from a high level what that policy is, like the Stanford speech that Secretary Tillerson gave, until we have such a moment, we're going to be a little bit concerned. But again, in terms of the key things that they've done, keeping the troops on, following the UN process, importantly, maintaining, doing what they can to maintain the ceasefire in Idlib and elsewhere, these are all good things.
Yes. Actually, we can conclude it here probably with the comments of Ambassador Jeffrey. And I would like to, on behalf of ORSAM, I would like to thank all the speakers that from the United States that came all the way from there for our panel. And I would like to also thank to you for joining us. And we hope we will see you in our future programs. Thank you again. So we will have some brief presence for our panelists. So please, Professor Ahmed, you can deliver.
I just want to thank Ambassador Jeffrey, Joel, Andrew, and Rich for rich insights, valuable insights, and also very happy to have you, and hope that this conversation, this dialogue continues, because we are in a global world. We are in the same boat mostly, but also in the region, to feel secure in other regions. I think also as a superpower, America should feel secure in the Middle East, which is at the crossroads of the whole world. So nice to have you again, and thanks for your valuable comments, Oytun, also Dr. Nouman, and I will hope to see you again in other events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. If you would just bear with us here, Dr. Ahmed is going to present some gifts to our